Time now for Focus, and in today's report we have exclusive footage from Yemen. Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, sharing some of its footage with us. It's one of the few NGOs still working in Yemen 2 years after fighting escalated. Thousands of civilians have been killed, many are hungry, and now a cholera outbreak is claiming lives. Vikram Singh reports.
We are in the Houthi stronghold in northern Yemen. This is what is left of Sada after 2 years of intensive bombing. Here, a powerful airstrike turned what used to be a market into this crater. This man lost everything when an airstrike hit his family home in March, killing his mother, his sister, and his 2 younger brothers.
These are part of the missiles that destroyed our house, and there are probably more remains in the rubble. But there were no military targets or centers in our neighborhood.
The Saudi coalition declared the whole city of Sada a war zone in violation of international law. The Saudis accused the civilians who remain in the city of supporting rebels, a way to justify the killing of women and children.
No house was spared. This house was hit. The one next to it too. We found Hassan's body in that house. The blast sent him all the way there. He was shredded to pieces. He had no hands, no legs left.
According to the United Nations, more than 10,000 people have died in the conflict, half of them civilians. Residents have documented the brutal air campaign using their smartphones. For the past 2 years, NGOs have repeatedly accused the coalition of war crimes. Topping the list is the regular targeting of health centers. MSF is one of the few organizations still working in Yemen. Today, the head of the Yemen mission is checking in on this hospital in Al-Kafla. It is one of the 4 health centers supported by the NGO that has been targeted by airstrikes. The attacks have worsened the humanitarian crisis.
Half
the hospitals are closed, either because they've been destroyed or because staff are too scared of the war and the threat of airstrikes here.
The few hospitals still working are stretched beyond capacity. Here, they're treating people with war wounds. 2 years of food shortage have added to the suffering of the population. 3 million Yemenis are believed to be on the brink of famine. 2 million of them are children.
Did he have diarrhea today?
Yes, 3 times. And he vomited several times.
MSF supports this pediatric center.
5.6 kilos.
Nurses measure and weigh the children to monitor their growth. This little boy is underweight.
He should weigh 5 kilos, but he's 3 levels below the average. He's about the size of a girl his age. At this level, it's a case of malnutrition, and we have to keep the child in for treatment. We give him additional doses of milk, 75 or 100 grams extra, depending on the case.
Today, NGOs are able to reach only 10% of the population, limiting treatment to people living in major cities or those who can afford to travel to hospitals.
We have nothing left. There's no work. We have nothing to do but to stay at home.
They recently stopped paying all employees and suspended all public transport services, so a lot of people can no longer reach us. We used to have more patients coming to our emergency room, but today they can no longer access these services because of the situation.
The medical staff here now face a new crisis. A cholera outbreak which has already affected 2,000 people and killed another 35 this month alone. With peace talks having stalled last August, there is little hope of the situation improving as Yemen's war and humanitarian crisis deepen by the day.
For more on this, I'm now joined in the studio by Aline from Première Urgence Internationale. Hello, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, your NGO is one of only a handful still operating in Yemen. We saw in the report how people are sick, they're hungry. Just what are you doing? What can you do to alleviate the suffering of civilians in Yemen?
So, yeah, a lot of civilians are suffering currently in Yemen. We estimate, together with the international humanitarian community, that 19 million persons are in need of humanitarian help in Yemen currently.
And how many are getting the aid?
It's difficult for us to access all areas due to many issues. The first one being the situation in terms of conflict. And yes, there is conflict. There is huge degradation and destructions due to the conflict. We have difficulties importing also the most important needs, the most important items for humanitarian action. We know that, for example, Hodeida port is currently active only at 10% of its capacity. And it's the one on which all of us rely to import. And not only all of us, in fact, all the Yemenis are relying on this port mainly to import food. So you can imagine the impact on the market prices. It's between 30% or 60% increase since last year on the main food items. So the impact is huge, as we saw in the image you showed us, on children, and it's a general impact. We estimate that 1/4 of the provinces are currently at emergency stage in terms of food security. So we at Première Urgence Internationale, we intervene in 2 governorates in the western part of the country, implementing food distribution and supporting the health centers. Because as we saw also, most of the health centers are not currently effective. Like 55% of the health centers are currently not functional, either because their staff are not paid and they cannot come, either because the people cannot come to the centers, or because some of them were destroyed. So it's a huge humanitarian crisis. There is action possible, but we need more access and more funds to be able to intervene.
On this issue of funds, would it make a difference, because you mentioned food insecurity, what's described as severe food insecurity, would the classification of this situation as famine make a difference on the international front in terms of how much money you would receive?
I tend to say that we should be careful with words, because famine is supposed to go with a specific situation, but what we know is that we are on the brink of famine. And in terms of mobilization, I think it's coming. We know that Antonio Guterres led a recent international conference on the situation. There are pledges for more support, additional support for Yemen. What we need is this support to effectively come in the field, and in the field, all parties to respect the need for humanitarian access for all our activities. So there is a huge need to continue the mobilization so that we know that the Hodeida port is able to function better and is able to receive more humanitarian items. We know that we need to be able to move in the country and to not to be impeded by the conflict activities for us to access to the population.
Now, I understand if you won't comment, obviously, on the political situation, but just so we understand, who is impeding this access? Who is in charge in these areas where you cannot get through?
I'll tend to say that we need the mobilization of all parties. So, first of all, due to our neutrality, I'm not going to point one or another party or one or another support, because that's not my main expertise. But what we see in the field is that we know that people are facing difficulties to access the services we are delivering, and we know that in all areas it's difficult currently to implement activities, as it is in most of the conflicts.
Is that why so many NGOs have left? Because there's just a handful left? Is it just because they couldn't get anything done?
Currently, we are amongst the NGOs active there, and I think most of the NGOs that were there before the conflict are still there. But there are security issues that we need to adapt our modalities of intervention, and it's difficult for new ones to come in fact. it's long, and it's a long process for new ones to come and support the ones who are active. We can intervene currently in Yemen. We need to be more active. We can be more active, but we can intervene now in Yemen. The issue is more that we want the people to be able to access the services, and we want the means to respond to the needs to access to the conflict areas.
Are there any signs at all that the situation will improve in terms of you being able to get the help to civilians who need it, and also just their suffering being alleviated generally?
I think it's a step-by-step process. So we can see that, again, as I said, there is a political mobilization, at least showing that indeed Yemen is becoming more and more a focus for some of the politicians that can effectively change the situation. So we hope that indeed our access will be granted and guaranteed, and that we can respond to what's important for us, the needs of the population in Yemen.
The situation, of course, complicated also by this outbreak of cholera, I'm afraid. Yeah. We'll have to leave it there, though. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Aline from Première Urgence Internationale.